So the term deep state,
Yeah.
it feels like it's everywhere these days, doesn't it?
It really does. It's become such a common phrase.
And, if you trace back its big recent splash into the mainstream, a lot of that really does seem to connect back to Donald Trump, especially around his 2016 campaign.
Oh, absolutely. His whole rhetoric about the swamp in Washington.
Yeah, and promising to drain it.
Right. That language definitely resonated. It kind of gave a name, didn't it, to this feeling some people already had about, well, hidden forces maybe running things behind the scenes.
Okay, so let's really get into this. For this deep dive, we're focusing on one particular source. It's a YouTube video from Mr. and Mrs. Gal. The title is Chaske.
Which translates roughly to, this episode is more dangerous, the person controlling everything behind the scenes.
Yeah, quite a title. So our mission here is basically to unpack how this video explains the deep state. We want to look at what they say it means, where the idea might have come from, and, the arguments for and against it actually existing, just trying to give you a clearer picture.
Sounds good. And the video does offer a pretty specific definition. It describes the deep state as essentially a non-elected group.
Not voted in.
Exactly. Think of it like a hidden network, maybe, composed of high-level government officials, career civil servants, the military-industrial complex,
Okay.
big players in finance, powerful corporations, and, of course, intelligence agencies. The video basically argues this is the group with the real power.
The ones actually pulling the levers, so to speak, regardless of who's in the White House.
That's the core idea presented, and their main driver, their objective.
What is it?
Well, according to the video, it all comes down to protecting their own vested interests, keeping their power, their influence, their advantages safe.
Okay, so preserving their status quo, but from this hidden, unelected position. Now, the video doesn't just define it, right? It talks about what this deep state allegedly does.
Oh, yeah. It makes some pretty big claims. The video suggests this group uses its power to, manipulate elections, control the economy,
Big stuff.
even initiate wars, and potentially eliminate people they see as threats. Serious allegations.
Definitely makes you pause. Now, the term itself, deep state,
Mm-hmm.
it didn't actually start in the U.S., did it? The video touches on its history.
That's right. The video traces it back to Turkey. Apparently, the idea of a Debandron devlet, a deep state, was a big deal there, especially thinking back to the 1960s through the 80s, a really politically rocky time.
Yeah, lots of instability then.
Exactly. And this alleged structure involved people from the military, intelligence agencies, political elites, and even connections to organized crime.
Wait, government and criminal groups working together? That sounds,
Oh.
like something from a spy novel.
It does, doesn't it? The video sort of implies this dynamic where the state might offer protection, and in return, these groups would handle, let's say, deniable operations or dirty work. Though it's really crucial to note, the Turkish government has always denied that such an organization existed.
Okay, important clarification. But the video mentions a specific event in Turkey that kind of blew these rumors wide open.
Yes, absolutely. The Susurlux scandal. This happened back on November 3rd, 1996. It was a car crash.
Just a car crash.
Well, on the surface.
Yeah.
But who was in the car? That was the explosive part. You had a known mafia leader, his girlfriend, who was a former beauty queen, a deputy police chief. And the only survivor was actually a member of parliament, all in the same car.
A mafia boss, a beauty queen, a top cop, and a politician. Okay, yeah, I can see how that would raise a lot of questions.
Exactly. The video argues this incident really highlighted these alleged murky connections between parts of the state, law enforcement, and organized crime. It lent a lot more credibility, at least in the public eye, to those deep state rumors. It shifted from just whispers to something people thought might actually be real.
So the term starts in Turkey, gains traction there after Susurluk.
Yeah.
But like you said, Trump was talking about a U.S. deep state, maybe even a global one.
Right. And the video connects this idea in the U.S. to, well, much older anxieties about hidden control.
How so?
It draws parallels to groups like the Illuminati.
Ah, the Illuminati.
Yeah, founded in 1776, interestingly the same year as American independence. And also the Freemasons, who go back even further to 1717. The video describes them as these huge, old, global secret societies.
Secret societies are always, fertile ground for these kinds of theories, aren't they?
Oh, definitely. Their secrecy kind of invites speculation. The video points out the Illuminati, maybe because they had more overt political aims historically, often get linked specifically to this idea of a hidden hand behind big world events, wars, pandemics, economic crashes.
The classic conspiracy theory stuff.
Right. But the video is also careful to say, look, these are largely rumors. There isn't really concrete proof connecting them in that way.
Okay, so these older secret societies were maybe the focus of earlier theories, but the video says the idea of who constitutes the U.S. deep state shifted over time.
Yes, exactly. As the U.S. became a global superpower, especially after World War II, during the Cold War,
Right.
the focus of these deep state narratives sort of shifted. The video suggests it moved towards the federal government itself, and particularly the big intelligence agencies, the CIA, FBI, NSO.
Because they became so powerful and operated in secret.
That seems to be the logic. Their sheer size, their budgets, the necessary secrecy around national security stuff. It naturally led some people to wonder about oversight and control. Are they really accountable?
That makes sense. And the video offers a reason why these kinds of deep state ideas seem to persist so strongly in the U.S. specifically.
It does. It connects it back to the country's origins, actually. The whole founding ethos was about rejecting powerful, entrenched European systems, right? There's this deep-seated American skepticism about unchecked authority.
A kind of built-in suspicion of power.
Sort of. And the video suggests this suspicion easily gets projected onto any group that seems too powerful or too secret, whether it's an old society or a modern intelligence agency. It fuels the idea that there must be some hidden agenda.
So, that cultural skepticism provides fertile ground.
Yeah.
Now, bringing back to the present and Donald Trump. The video really stresses his role in making deep state a household term recently.
Absolutely. It highlights how he used that specific term to label his opponents. People within the government bureaucracy, on Wall Street, in the media, in academia.
Basically anyone who opposed him or his agenda.
That's how many of his supporters saw it, yeah. They believed these groups were actively trying to undermine his Make America Great Again platform. The deep state became the explanation for resistance.
Right. Okay, so the video lays all that out. Then it gets to the big question. Is it real? Does this deep state actually exist? And it looks at both sides, the skeptics and the believers. Let's start with the skeptics. What are their main points, according to the video?
Well, the biggest one is pretty straightforward. Where's the proof?
The hard evidence.
Exactly. Skeptics point out that despite all the talk, there wasn't really concrete evidence presented, names, specific plans. This makes them think it was maybe more of a rhetorical strategy.
A way to fire up the base against a kind of shadowy, undefined enemy.
That's the argument. And they also worry that it's too easy to just slap the deep state label on anyone who disagrees. It can shut down legitimate debate or dissent within the government.
Just dismiss criticism as being part of the conspiracy.
Right. Plus, there's this other concern the video raises. The idea that constantly attacking a supposed deep state might actually push a leader to install their own people everywhere.
Replacing the old guard with loyalists.
Yeah, even if those loyalists don't have the experience, so you could end up creating a different kind of unaccountable structure, just loyal to you, sort of counter deep state maybe.
That's a fascinating point. Did the video give examples of things skeptics pointed to during Trump's term?
It did. It mentioned his daughter, Ivanka Trump, getting a high-level advisor role with top security clearance, despite her background being mainly in fashion and business.
Right, that caused a stir.
And Rex Tillerson, the former ExxonMobil CEO with ties to Russia, becoming Secretary of State with no prior government experience. Also, Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, coming from the Amway fortune, again, without a background in public education.
So appointments based more on loyalty or connection than traditional qualifications, potentially.
That was the concern raised. The video also mentions things like appointing a large number of political allies and donors as ambassadors rather than career diplomats. And there was talk about a potential government efficiency role for Elon Musk, another supporter, raising questions about outside influence. So the skeptical view, basically, is that the whole narrative damages trust in institutions and can just be an excuse when policies don't work out.
Okay, that covers the skeptical side pretty well.
Yeah.
What about the believers? What arguments does the video present for why someone would believe in a deep state?
Believers, according to the video, point to a few key things. One is this idea of policy continuity, meaning that for decades, U.S. policy, foreign policy, economic policy seemed to stay on a pretty consistent track, regardless of whether a Democrat or Republican was president.
Ah, the feeling that things don't really change that much no matter who wins the election.
Exactly. Believers see that consistency, at least, they argue, until Trump disrupted it as evidence of some underlying force guiding things.
Okay, what else?
They also point to the sheer power and independence of agencies like the CIA, FBI, NSA.
The intelligence community again.
Right. And the video specifically mentions Edward Snowden's revelations about mass surveillance. For believers, that was like proof positive of agencies operating with huge power and maybe not enough oversight.
Yeah, the Snowden leaks definitely fueled those concerns.
Absolutely. And the video brings up something else often cited, President Eisenhower's farewell address.
His warning about the military-industrial complex.
That's the one. Believers see that complex defense contractors, lobbyists, military brass as a potential core part of a deep state, with a vested interest in conflict and military spending.
A classic argument that's been around for a long time.
It has. Then the video broadens it to include the influence of large corporations generally through lobbying, campaign donations.
Money in politics.
Right, giving them huge sway. The video even uses Elon Musk's support for Trump as a modern example of that potential financial influence. But then it gets into something really specific about corporate ownership.
Ah, yes, this part was interesting. The shareholder analysis.
Exactly. The video looked at the top shareholders of some of the biggest companies globally, like Walmart, Amazon, Apple, United Health, Microsoft, Coca-Cola, big names.
Okay, and what did it find?
It found that a very small number of huge asset management firms kept appearing at the top of the list, primarily Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street.
The giant investment firms.
The giants, yeah. They hold significant stakes across a massive range of companies in seemingly different industries.
So the takeaway for you, the listener, is that just a few financial players own big chunks of, well, almost everything.
That's the implication presented. It raises questions about, how much real competition and diversity of control there is in the economy.
What kind of questions? What are the potential effects of that concentration?
Well, the video suggests it could lead to less actual competition. It uses Coke and Pepsi as an example. If the same big firms are major shareholders in both.
They might not want them to compete too fiercely on price.
Kind of, yeah. It's like they have an interest in the overall market doing well, maybe more than in one company crushing the other. It could dampen real rivalry.
Like they're managing the whole sector.
That's one interpretation offered.
Yeah.
And the video notes this pattern extends to defense contractors, too. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Big Pharma, like Pfizer.
Okay.
So the argument becomes, could these incredibly powerful financial groups be perhaps an instrument of a deep state? A way to exert economic influence, maybe even without explicit orders.
Less about secret meetings, more about the systemic power of concentrated capital.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. The video also briefly mentions that believers sometimes point to unexplained historical events in the U.S. as evidence.
Like conspiracy theories around assassinations or crises.
Potentially, yes, though the video doesn't detail them, likely because they're so speculative and lack solid proof. We should definitely stress that those kinds of claims often lack verifiable support.
Good point.
And finally, the video notes that all the clashes during the Trump years between the White House, the courts, the media, different government officials, proponents, saw that friction as evidence of the deep state pushing back against him.
So any conflict within the system could be interpreted that way.
Okay. The video seems to conclude that it's still a really debated topic, but it offered some alternative ways to think about what a deep state might even be, right?
It did. One idea floated is that maybe it's not some single conscious group with a master plan.
Not like a secret committee. Right. Maybe it's more like a complex network. A web of overlapping power centers, long-standing interests, shared assumptions and ideologies, all kind of naturally influencing decisions without a central director, more like an emergent property of the whole system.
Like inertia, almost. A system that reinforces itself.
Something like that. And the video even briefly touches on a really provocative idea that if such thing exists, maybe it's not automatically bad.
How so?
Well, some theories suggest it could perhaps provide a kind of stability, a baseline continuity, even if it operates outside democratic accountability.
The idea that something shadowy could actually be a stabilizing force. That's certainly a different take.
It is. It really makes you think about what we value more, stability or transparency. Okay, so then near the end, the video shifts back to Trump and lays out his plan, supposedly, to dismantle the deep state if he were reelected.
Right, those 10 points, they seem pretty specific.
They were. The video references a speech from October 7th, where he apparently listed them. Things like bringing back a 2020 executive order to make it easier to fire federal employees he saw as insubordinate.
Okay, increasing presidential power over the bureaucracy.
Yeah, and doing a huge review of intelligence and national security agencies to root out people he considered corrupt. Also overhauling FISA, the Surveillance Act, to prevent perceived abuses.
More control and oversight of intelligence. What else?
He proposed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, quite a term, to expose alleged spying by this deep state and declassify documents, and a crackdown on what he calls fake news, leakers, disinformation, clearly aimed at media and internal critics.
Right. Any other points?
Making inspectors general more independent from their agencies, creating a new independent audit system for intelligence agencies, specifically mentioning preventing surveillance like what he alleged happened to his campaign. Then moving chunks of federal agencies out of Washington, D.C. to kind of break up the concentration of power there. He apparently cited moving the Bureau of Land Management to Colorado and talked about potentially shifting 100,000 jobs.
Decentralizing the government physically?
Yeah. Banning officials from quickly taking jobs in industries. They regulated the revolving door issue.
Okay.
And finally, pushing for a constitutional amendment for term limits for Congress members.
Quite a list. And the video noted his own assessment of these measures.
Yeah, interestingly, it mentioned that Trump apparently believed these steps would weaken the deep state, but maybe not eliminate it entirely.
Acknowledging its resilience, perhaps. And the video wraps up with a final question, doesn't it? Kind of a twist.
It does. It poses this interesting puzzle. If the deep state is supposedly so powerful, so controlling, how did Trump, this total outsider challenging the system, manage to get elected in the first place?
Good question.
And then it floats this really intriguing possibility. What if his election was actually allowed or even subtly engineered by the deep state, maybe to make it look like they don't exist, or perhaps to limit his effectiveness once he was in power?
Wow. That really flips the script at the end there, layers upon layers.
Yeah.
Okay, so after diving into this source, it's clear the whole deep state idea is incredibly complex, it's definitely controversial, and it taps into some really fundamental questions about power, trust, and how government works.
Absolutely. It's got history, it's got very modern relevance thanks to figures like Trump, and as we've heard, there are arguments on both sides and a lot of skepticism too.
Right, the lack of definitive proof, the different interpretations.
Yeah.
It really highlights how hard it is to pin down something so, well, potentially hidden or maybe even just systemic rather than coordinated.
For sure. And even if some version of it exists, what it is and whether its impact is good or bad is clearly far from settled.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Considering everything we've talked about today, based on this source, how does believing or not believing in a deep state potentially change how you look at political news, how you understand power, how you view your own government's actions?
Yeah. What difference does that belief make in your interpretation of the world?
Definitely something to think about. We encourage you to keep exploring, maybe check out the source if you can, and as always, form your own informed conclusions.